He has it all: money, status, and the perfect fiancé. But the renowned New York architect hides an emptiness that no fortune can fill. When a risky decision threatens to expose the lies propping up his luxurious life, Mike uncovers shocking truths about who truly matters and who's willing to stand by his side when everything falls apart. Mike woke up every morning to the muffled sounds of New York City traffic outside, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of his luxurious apartment. The panoramic view of the city seemed to whisper something he refused to hear, that his life was more of a spectacle than a reality. The impeccably designed furniture, the aroma of expensive coffee brewing in the flawless kitchen, everything reflected a success that strangely weighed on his shoulders like a burden. It was a life many envied, yet one he could barely endure. Samantha, his fiancée, was as polished as the apartment. Always with a rehearsed smile for the cameras and the perfect outfit for the most exclusive events. She accompanied him to parties, making him shine like a trophy, but their conversations were as superficial as the extravagant decorations of the venues they frequented. Mike, a renowned architect, felt as though his creativity and passion had been lost in the labyrinth of others' expectations and the weight of money. Endless meetings were more a parade of egos than genuine exchanges of ideas. Mike spent his days negotiating million-dollar contracts with an enthusiasm that vanished as soon as the next deal was signed. Deep down, he knew something was profoundly wrong. However, it was easier to blame the world around him than admit he had built this gilded prison himself. At night, alone in his penthouse, Mike found himself staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. The emptiness felt greater in the silent early hours when even the city's noise couldn't fill the echo of his dissatisfaction. The days seemed endless, repeating like someone had pressed replay on a life that no longer made sense. Samantha often reminded him of their obligations. "You can't miss the dinner with the foundation board," she would say, checking her schedule on the latest tablet. Mike would agree, knowing those nights amounted to fake smiles and conversations about figures and appearances. Samantha's presence was so calculated that he often wondered if she saw him as a man or merely an extension of her ambition. Mike began to realize his life had more twists and turns than he cared to admit, yet all seemed to lead him back to the same starting point. He wasn't exactly sure where things had gone wrong, but he felt something buried in his past was holding him back. Perhaps it was the lies he told himself daily, that he was happy, that he had everything anyone could ever want. There was something bitter about how he viewed his trajectory. Each new contract signed, each architectural project that made headlines, only deepened his dissatisfaction. He wondered if he was building something real or just another facade, like those adorning the skyscrapers he designed. Even the money, once a clear goal, now seemed more like a symbol than a reward. Flashes of the early days of his career would come to him during sleepless nights. Mike remembered how, in the beginning, he had dreamed of creating spaces that brought beauty and meaning to people's lives. Now, he found himself a prisoner of contracts with astronomical figures but no soul. Architecture, once his passion, had become just another lucrative business. The weight of living this perfect life began to feel almost unbearable. He didn't know exactly what he was searching for, but he felt on the verge of either a collapse or an awakening. In this state of unease, he began to question everything. Perhaps there was something more than what he had built so far. Something real. On the morning of his birthday, Mike woke up with an uncomfortable sense of emptiness. The sunlight streamed through the flawless walls of his apartment, but no light seemed to reach the dark corner in his chest. Samantha, predictably, had already left early to prepare for a charity event. It was no surprise. What should have been a special day for him had turned into just another agenda filled with commitments that didn't include him. He glanced at his phone, only to see automated messages from luxury brands offering cold, generic birthday wishes. Determined to escape the suffocating apathy, Mike grabbed his coat and stepped out onto the bustling streets. The idea of a purposeless walk felt more appealing than confronting the echo of his solitude at home. Wandering aimlessly, he found himself in a square where street artists displayed their creations. There was something about the energy of the place that drew him in, a genuine simplicity that sharply contrasted with everything he knew. It was there that he noticed Georgia. With paint-stained hands and a shy smile, she sold small watercolor paintings beside an improvised easel. There was something captivating about her presence, an aura of calm and authenticity. Mike, accustomed to transactions and figures, didn't expect to feel so intrigued by someone so far removed from his world. He hesitated but eventually approached, drawn to a piece depicting the sunset over a city bridge. "Is it your birthday?" Georgia asked, smiling as she noticed the single candle Mike held in a bakery bag. He laughed, surprised by her observation. "Looks like no one wanted to celebrate with you," she added gently but directly. That comment, spoken without judgment, struck something in Mike that he couldn't quite explain. In just a few minutes of conversation, she seemed to see something that even Samantha hadn't noticed in years. After buying the painting, Mike learned that Georgia worked at a nearby cafe to support her art. Curious, he decided to visit her that same day, as if trying to understand what made her so different. Georgia welcomed him with the same simplicity, offering him coffee and a casual conversation. For Mike, it was as if the weight of his grandiose life was left outside that door, replaced by warmth and sincerity. Over the hours, she shared stories of her struggles as an artist and her choice to prioritize happiness over status. Mike listened intently, absorbing every word as if they were answers to questions he had never dared to ask. The contrast between George's life and his own made him question whether he had lost his way somewhere along his path. Was there something more valuable than everything he had worked so hard to achieve? Before he left, Georgia handed him a small piece of paper with a handwritten phrase. "Simplicity sometimes reveals the deepest truths." Mike slipped the note into his pocket, unaware of the impact it would have in the days to come. Returning home, he looked at the newly purchased painting and felt an odd sense of comfort, as though he had found a forgotten piece of himself. That brief encounter left him restless. The image of Georgia, her words, and even the aroma of coffee lingered in his mind like a reminder of something he couldn't name. Mike knew there was something special about her, something that challenged the lies he had told himself for years. He didn't know what would come next, but he could no longer ignore the spark that had been ignited. In the days following his encounter with Georgia, Mike found himself trying to suppress the whirlwind of thoughts she had stirred within him. He convinced himself it was nothing more than a fleeting distraction, something that shouldn't interfere with the carefully constructed life he had built. Sitting at the conference table, reviewing million-dollar contracts, he repeated to himself that his career and status were all that mattered. Yet, an unsettling feeling lingered, one he couldn't seem to shake. Samantha noticed his more introspective demeanor but showed little interest in delving deeper. "You've been distracted lately," she remarked during a dinner at an exclusive restaurant, her eyes fixed on her phone. Mike replied with a rehearsed smile, attributing it to work fatigue. He knew this wasn't the time, or the person, to share the doubts that haunted him. The words Georgia had spoken echoed in his mind whenever he returned home and stared at the painting hanging on his wall. That captured simplicity seemed to mock the emptiness he felt. Mike tried to ignore it, telling himself it was all just a passing phase. After all, what could possibly exist outside the life he had worked so hard to build? Samantha, the events, the wealth, these things were supposed to be enough, weren't they? One night, Mike pulled out the note Georgia had given him and read the handwritten words again. He felt a pang in his chest, as if those words were daring him to confront truths he had avoided for years. But instead of taking action, he tucked the paper back into his pocket, almost as an act of defiance. Acknowledging it would mean facing the uncomfortable reality of his life, and he wasn't ready for that yet. The pressure to maintain appearances was relentless. Jonathan, Samantha's father, frequently called to discuss wedding preparations, emphasizing how their union would be beneficial for everyone. Mike listened passively, feeling increasingly detached from the world around him. He knew his life was full of twists and turns, yet it seemed to circle back to the same hollow place. In an attempt to distract himself, Mike buried himself deeper in work. He accepted projects he knew wouldn't bring him satisfaction, just to fill the time and avoid thinking about Georgia. But even in the midst of meetings and negotiations, his mind wandered back to that small cafe and the artist who had ignited a spark within him. He fought against the idea that their encounter could change everything. When Samantha brought up the need to set a wedding date, Mike felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want to disappoint her, or himself, by admitting his doubts. Yet, he knew that continuing on this path was like building a house on a foundation that would eventually crumble. He was trapped between the fear of losing what he had and the possibility that something far more meaningful might await him. Mike began avoiding places that reminded him of Georgia. He stopped walking through the square and chose different cafes, as if that could keep the discomfort at bay. Yet no matter how hard he tried to escape, the memory of their meeting stayed with him. Georgia's kindness and authenticity stood in stark contrast to the superficial world he inhabited, forcing him to question whether his reluctance was, in truth, fear. Each night as he stared at the ceiling, Mike wondered, what if he was wrong? What if Georgia was more than just a fleeting encounter, more than a pause in the monotony of his routine? But the idea of risking everything he had built left him paralyzed. It was easier to stick with the life he knew than face the uncertainties of something new, or at least, that's what he told himself. And so, Mike remained in his comfort zone, trying to silence the voices urging him toward change. But the discomfort persisted, growing louder with each passing day. He knew he couldn't ignore it forever. Something was about to give, and when it did, his life would never be the same. On a cloudy afternoon, Mike gave in to the curiosity he had been suppressing. He returned to the cafe where he had met Georgia, unsure of what he hoped to gain from the encounter. When he stepped inside, the space was bustling with activity, but her warm smile stood out amidst the chaos. Georgia greeted him with a quiet enthusiasm, as though she understood, without needing words, that his visit was about more than just coffee. In that moment, he felt a sense of familiarity he hadn't realized he was craving. Mike ordered a coffee and settled at a table by the window. Georgia, in her natural and unassuming way, found a few minutes to sit with him. He commented on the painting he had purchased, saying it seemed to have a life of its own. Georgia smiled and leaned in slightly. "Sometimes art shows us what we're trying to hide from ourselves," she said, leaving Mike momentarily speechless. She had a way of distilling his inner chaos into simple, profound statements. Their conversations became a sanctuary for Mike. Georgia shared stories of her life, her challenges, and her passion for capturing fleeting moments through her art. Her sincerity was disarming, and for the first time in years, Mike felt safe enough to let down his guard. She spoke of finding beauty in the smallest things, a beam of sunlight on the sidewalk, an unexpected conversation, and it made him realize how much he had stopped noticing the world around him. During one of their chats, Georgia asked, "What makes you truly happy, Mike?" The question caught him off guard. He stammered, trying to come up with an answer, only to realize he didn't have one. The heavy silence that followed hung between them, but Georgia didn't press him. Instead, she laughed softly and said, "I guess that's something you need to figure out." Her words lingered in his mind for days, like an invitation he couldn't ignore. Gradually, Mike began to open up to Georgia. He told her about his career, how he had once found meaning in architecture but had lost it along the way. He admitted how the glamour and money had turned his passion into just another business. Georgia listened intently, offering no judgment, only the space for him to express himself. It felt as though she understood his pain without him having to explain. Georgia suggested that Mike revisit the reasons he became an architect in the first place. "Maybe you don't need to abandon everything, just rediscover why you started," she said, her eyes sparkling with conviction. Mike had never considered that before. To him, the only option seemed to be continuing to pretend or walking away entirely. But Georgia made him realize there might be a middle path, one he hadn't had the courage to explore. Over the following days, Mike began to seek small moments of reconnection with himself. He dug out old notebooks filled with sketches of projects he had dreamed of but never pursued. It was strange, almost foreign, but it also felt invigorating. It was as if he was recovering something he thought he had lost, not just his passion for architecture, but a part of himself that had been buried under the weight of others' expectations. Unknowingly, Georgia became a mentor to Mike. Her perspective on life, her encouraging words, and her own struggle to live authentically inspired him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He realized he couldn't continue ignoring the impact she had on his life. With every conversation, it felt as though the superficiality surrounding him was being slowly replaced by something genuine and meaningful. Mike didn't yet know how to take the next step, but one thing was certain: he didn't want to lose what he had found in Georgia, not just the connection with her, but the reconnection with himself. Something within him was shifting, and he knew that sooner or later he would have to confront the choices he had been avoiding. The world he knew was about to be challenged, and Mike couldn't run from it any longer. Mike spent days reflecting on his conversations with Georgia and the choices that had led him to the life he now lived. He knew that to bring about change, he would need to challenge everything he had built, including his relationship with Samantha. The idea of questioning their future together filled him with unease, but it also seemed inevitable. He had to know if she was truly by his side for love or simply for the status he provided. That's when he came up with a bold plan: to fake a financial crisis. One evening, during a quiet dinner at home, Mike initiated the conversation with Samantha. He told her about a supposed issue with a major project that threatened the stability of his firm. Her expression changed almost immediately. The usual polished smile disappeared, replaced by a look of concern that felt more calculated than genuine. "Does this mean you could lose everything?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. Mike replied that, yes, it was a real possibility. In the days that followed, the emotional distance between them grew palpable. Samantha began canceling joint plans and avoiding social events where they were expected to appear as a couple. At home, she seemed perpetually occupied, either checking her phone or discussing plans with Jonathan. Mike, for his part, observed her every move as though piecing together a puzzle. He wanted to believe she still cared for him, but her actions painted a starkly different picture. Jonathan wasted no time inserting himself into the situation. He requested a private meeting with Mike at an upscale restaurant, arriving with his characteristic air of authority. "You understand how important this marriage is for all of us," he began, his tone making it clear that their union was less about love and more about strategic alliances. "Handle this situation swiftly, Mike. It's not in anyone's interest for things to become unstable." The conversation only fueled Mike's growing sense of disillusionment. Amidst the increasing tension at home, Georgia remained an anchor for Mike, even without knowing about his plan. He continued visiting the cafe regularly, finding solace in their conversations and her quiet support. "Sometimes you have to lose control to find your way," she told him one afternoon, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Mike smiled at her words, but deep down, they resonated more deeply than he was willing to admit. As the days passed, Mike began preparing himself for an inevitable confrontation. The fabricated financial crisis had become a catalyst for exposing the truth he had long avoided. Samantha was more concerned with appearances than with their relationship. Although painful, this realization also brought a strange sense of relief. It was as though he were finally seeing his life for what it truly was. Still, fear held him back. What would happen if he ended things with Samantha? How would he face the society that had placed him on a pedestal? And most importantly, how would he rebuild his life after dismantling the foundations upon which it was built? Mike knew these questions would need answers, but for now, he focused on the next step. The confrontation loomed closer, and he was steeling himself for the fallout. One night, alone in his penthouse, Mike looked at George's painting on the wall. The simplicity of the image seemed to taunt him, urging him to confront the complexities of his reality. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a growing determination. He couldn't keep pretending. The moment of truth was near, and Mike knew there was no turning back. The tension between Mike and Samantha grew heavier with each passing day. His fabricated financial crisis had pulled back the curtain on their relationship, revealing cracks that were impossible to ignore. Samantha, once always eager to be the center of attention at his side, now seemed distant. Her texts were short, her tone cold, and her presence at home was marked by an unsettling silence. Mike began to accept a truth he had long avoided. Their connection had been shallow from the start. Jonathan, Samantha's father, didn't waste any time applying pressure. He called Mike into a high-end restaurant for what was clearly a strategic meeting. "This situation needs to be resolved quickly, Mike," he said, swirling a glass of wine in his hand. "A marriage between you and Samantha strengthens ties that benefit us all. You're too smart to let personal issues jeopardize that. Jonathan's words felt less like advice and more like a command, leaving Mike simmering with frustration. Meanwhile, Georgia became an increasingly important presence in Mike's life. She remained blissfully unaware of his elaborate deception and simply continued to be her authentic self. Her quiet encouragement and unwavering sincerity were a stark contrast to the manipulation he faced from Samantha and Jonathan. Sometimes the biggest answers come from the questions you're too scared to ask, Georgia said one afternoon, her words piercing through Mike's carefully constructed defenses. One day, Georgia invited Mike to an event she was helping organize, an art exhibition showcasing local talent in a revitalized community space. Hesitant at first, Mike agreed to go. The event was unlike anything he was used to, vibrant, raw, and utterly devoid of pretension. Watching people celebrate creativity for its own sake struck a chord within him. It reminded him of why he had pursued architecture in the first place, before it became entangled with wealth and status. Back at home, Samantha continued to avoid meaningful conversations. When Mike tried to discuss the supposed challenges his firm was facing, she either deflected or changed the subject entirely. Her focus remained on wedding plans and maintaining her image. "We need to think about how this will look to our friends," she said one evening, as if their relationship were a public relations campaign rather than a partnership. Her detachment only deepened Mike's resolve to confront the truth. Jonathan, sensing Mike's growing hesitation, became even more assertive. He suggested that Mike pursue risky business deals to save face and ensure the wedding went ahead as planned. "Think strategically, not emotionally," Jonathan urged, as though their lives were nothing more than pieces on a corporate chessboard. Mike listened silently, but internally, something shifted. He was done being controlled. Amidst all this, Georgia's presence remained a beacon of clarity. She didn't offer solutions but instead inspired Mike to look inward. When he confided in her about the pressure he was under, she responded simply, "Maybe what's right isn't what they want, it's what you know deep down you have to do." Her words stayed with him, giving him strength in moments of doubt. The duality of Mike's life became impossible to ignore. On one side was the hollow, superficial world of Samantha and Jonathan, built on appearances and transactions. On the other was the authenticity he experienced with Georgia, who saw him for who he truly was. Each day, it became clearer that these two worlds could not coexist. He would have to choose, and the decision would shape the rest of his life. The tests Mike faced were not just about Samantha or Jonathan, they were about himself. Could he muster the courage to break away from the lies he had been living? Could he embrace the vulnerability required to start anew? These questions loomed over him, but he knew the time for answers was drawing near. The tension was building, and Mike felt the confrontation growing inevitable. Mike began to see his life with a newfound clarity, and the truth wasn't easy to face. Every interaction with Samantha and Jonathan seemed to strip away another layer of denial, exposing a reality he had tried to ignore for years. His world was built on appearances and lies. The weight of this realization was heavy, but it also felt liberating. He was starting to understand that his hesitance to act wasn't just about fear of losing his status, it was about confronting himself. One evening, after a strained dinner with Samantha, Mike found himself retreating to his home office. The room was immaculate, filled with sleek furniture and artificial plants, but it felt lifeless. He stared at his old architectural designs stored on his computer, wondering when he had stopped creating with passion and started designing for profit alone. Each project felt more hollow than the last, a stark reminder of how far he'd drifted from his original dreams. Samantha, meanwhile, continued to evade meaningful discussions. Whenever Mike attempted to bring up their future, she brushed him off with distractions, often focusing on trivial wedding details. "We still need to decide on the honeymoon destination," she said one evening, her voice laced with impatience. "It has to be somewhere Instagram-worthy." The shallowness of her words made Mike's chest tighten. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. His visits to Georgia became his only moments of solace. Each time he walked into the cafe, she greeted him with a warmth that felt genuine. During one visit, he confided, "Sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life." Georgia gave him a knowing look and replied simply, Maybe it's time to start living your own. Her words struck him like a bell tolling, a call to action he couldn't ignore. Mike began to understand that the problem wasn't just Samantha or Jonathan, it was him. He had allowed himself to get trapped in a life he didn't recognize, let alone want. Facing that truth meant admitting he had played a role in his own unhappiness. It was a sobering thought, but also a necessary one. He was descending into the deepest parts of himself, where the lies he had lived could no longer survive. Nights became longer and more restless. Mike often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions. He thought about Georgia, her authenticity, and the way she had challenged him to look at his life differently. He thought about Samantha, and how she symbolized everything he needed to leave behind. The internal conflict consumed him, but it also prepared him for the decision he knew was coming. Jonathan, sensing Mike's hesitation, ramped up his efforts to control the narrative. During yet another tense conversation, he implied that pulling out of the wedding would have consequences beyond their personal lives. "You'll lose more than just Samantha," Jonathan warned. "This could damage your reputation and your business." But Mike was no longer swayed by these tactics. He was beginning to see Jonathan's manipulation for what it truly was, a desperate attempt to preserve a crumbling facade. Mike realized that the confrontation he was dreading wasn't just with Samantha or Jonathan, it was with himself. He needed to confront the lies he had told himself for so long, the compromises he had made, and the fear that had kept him stuck. It was terrifying, but it also felt like the only way forward. He was descending into a personal reckoning, a moment of truth that would either break him or set him free. One evening, Mike sat alone in his living room, staring at the painting he had bought from Georgia. Its simplicity seemed to mock the complexities of his life, urging him to find the courage to make a change. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, feeling both the weight of his decisions and the growing resolve to face them. He knew the confrontation was near, and he couldn't avoid it any longer. The gala event was just days away, and Mike knew it would be the perfect moment to confront everything that had been building inside him. He still didn't have a concrete plan for how he would face Samantha and Jonathan, but he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. This night would be the tipping point. As Samantha meticulously reviewed her outfit choices for the event, Mike observed her with a quiet detachment. She seemed entirely unaware of the storm brewing within him. The night of the event arrived, and the venue radiated opulence. Chandeliers sparkled, the air was filled with murmurs of polite conversation, and everyone in attendance was dressed to impress. Mike moved through the crowd with a practiced smile, exchanging pleasantries with people he barely knew. The grandeur of it all felt stifling. He had spent years in this world, yet tonight it felt utterly foreign. Samantha, by contrast, thrived in the spotlight, gliding through the room with her signature charm. As the evening progressed, Jonathan approached Mike with a stern expression. "We need to talk," he said, leading him to a private corner of the venue. Jonathan wasted no time. "Mike, the marriage can't be delayed any longer. People are starting to ask questions, and it's not good for either of us." His words dripped with authority, treating the union like a business transaction rather than a personal commitment. For Mike, it was the final straw. "Is this about people, Jonathan? Or is it about you?" Mike's voice was calm but firm, laced with an edge of defiance. "You've never cared about me or Samantha, have you? This is just another deal for you, a way to maintain your image." Jonathan's face tightened, but Mike didn't stop. "Well, I'm done being part of it. I'm done living a lie." For the first time in years, Mike felt the weight of his words match the conviction behind them. Without waiting for a response, Mike turned and headed back to the main hall. Samantha was surrounded by a group of guests, her laugh light and rehearsed. He called her name, and the room seemed to pause as she turned to face him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. She hesitated but followed him to a quieter area. Her polished exterior faltered as Mike began to speak. "I can't do this anymore, Samantha," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This relationship, it's not real. We both know it." Samantha's initial reaction was denial. "Mike, this isn't the time for this conversation." But he pressed on, determined to say what needed to be said. If not now, then when? I can't keep pretending we're happy. I can't keep living this life just because it looks good on the outside. The silence that followed was heavy. Samantha finally admitted, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that she was more invested in their image than in their actual relationship. I didn't want to lose what we built, she said softly, but Mike could hear the emptiness in her words. He didn't feel anger, only a deep sadness and an even deeper sense of relief. This was the end, but it was also a beginning. As the event continued around them, Mike did something unexpected. He took the microphone from the MC and addressed the room. We gather here tonight to celebrate success, but I want to remind everyone that success built on lies isn't success at all. His words were vague enough to avoid scandal but pointed enough for those who knew the context. He handed back the microphone and left the venue, stepping into the crisp night air with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Outside, under the glowing city lights, Mike took a deep breath. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't fully anticipate, but for the first time, he felt ready. He had faced his fears and spoken his truth. Now, all that remained was to rebuild from the ground up, with authenticity and purpose as his foundation. As Mike walked away from the gala that night, the cool night air felt like the first breath of freedom he had taken in years. The burden of maintaining appearances, of living a life that wasn't truly his, had finally been lifted. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to perform or prove himself. His steps were light, his mind surprisingly clear, and though uncertainty loomed ahead, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had chosen the truth, and that choice was its own reward. The next morning, Mike woke up to a quiet apartment that seemed different, though nothing had physically changed. Gone were the incessant calls and texts from Samantha and Jonathan. The absence of their demands felt like a gift, a blank slate on which he could begin to rewrite his life. He spent the morning reflecting, sipping coffee slowly at his kitchen counter, as the realization of his newfound freedom began to settle in. Later that day, Mike returned to the cafe where Georgia worked. When he walked in, her warm smile greeted him like a beacon. He shared the events of the previous night with her, the confrontation, the liberation, and the decision to walk away from it all. Georgia listened intently, her gaze steady and reassuring. When he finished, she smiled softly. "I'm proud of you," she said, her words simple yet profoundly impactful. Mike hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them. Georgia's encouragement gave Mike the confidence to explore what truly mattered to him. He started revisiting old architectural sketches he had tucked away, projects he had dreamed of but never pursued. They were designs that prioritized people over profit, focusing on creating spaces that fostered community and connection. Mike felt a spark of the passion that had driven him to become an architect in the first place, a passion he thought had been extinguished long ago. Together, Mike and Georgia began working on ideas to revitalize neglected areas of the city. Georgia brought her artistic vision, painting murals that brought color and life to the spaces, while Mike focused on the architecture. It wasn't just a collaboration, it was a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. For Mike, these projects weren't just about buildings, they were about creating something meaningful, something that reflected his rediscovered purpose. The simple joys of this new life became Mike's greatest reward. He no longer needed the grand gestures or the validation of others. Sharing a quiet moment with Georgia over coffee or seeing a child smile in a space he had helped transform filled him with a sense of fulfillment he had never known. Each day felt like a step closer to the life he was meant to live, one built on authenticity and connection. Mike's work began to draw attention, but this time for all the right reasons. Organizations reached out to collaborate, inspired by his commitment to community-focused design. He found himself speaking at events, not about wealth or success, but about purpose and the importance of creating spaces that truly serve people. For the first time, Mike felt that his work aligned with his values, and the recognition he received felt genuine. The relationship between Mike and Georgia deepened naturally. There was no need for grand declarations or dramatics. Their connection was rooted in understanding and shared experiences. They found joy in the simplicity of everyday moments, working side by side, walking through the city, or sharing a meal after a long day. With Georgia, Mike felt truly seen and accepted, something he hadn't realized he was missing. Mike's reward wasn't just his newfound peace or his thriving projects. It was the sense that he had finally reclaimed his life. He had faced his fears, spoken his truth, and embraced the person he had become. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, Mike felt ready to face it, knowing he had built a foundation that could withstand anything. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new beginning. Mike's life began to take on a rhythm that felt entirely new, yet deeply familiar, as though he were reconnecting with a part of himself he had long forgotten. His days were no longer defined by lavish events or cutthroat business meetings. Instead, they were filled with meaningful work, designing community spaces, collaborating with Georgia on artistic projects, and engaging with people who valued what he was trying to build. He was no longer constructing facades. He was creating places where people could thrive. Georgia was by his side every step of the way. Their partnership wasn't confined to their projects. It extended into the quiet moments they shared. Whether they were brainstorming ideas over coffee or painting murals late into the evening, their connection deepened naturally. Georgia's grounded presence reminded Mike of the beauty in simplicity, something he had overlooked for most of his life. She didn't just inspire him, she anchored him. Mike began to see the fruits of his work not in accolades or financial gain, but in the joy and gratitude of those his projects impacted. He watched children play in revitalized parks, families gather in newly designed community centers, and artists showcase their work in spaces that had once been neglected. Each moment was a reminder of why he had chosen this path. These weren't just buildings, they were symbols of hope and connection. Despite the progress, the echoes of his old life occasionally resurfaced. Mike encountered former colleagues or clients who questioned his decisions. "You could have had it all," one remarked during a chance meeting. Mike smiled, unfazed. "I do have it all," he replied, realizing how much his definition of success had evolved. He no longer needed external validation to feel fulfilled. Samantha and Jonathan remained distant figures in his life, though their paths occasionally crossed. During one such encounter at a charity event, Samantha approached him. She commented on how different he seemed, lighter, more at peace. "I didn't understand it then," she said quietly, "but I see it now. You made the right choice." Her words, unexpected and genuine, reaffirmed that Mike had left behind the life that no longer served him. Mike also began speaking publicly about his journey, sharing not just his professional expertise but the personal transformation that had led him there. His talks resonated with others who felt trapped by societal expectations or their own fears. Mike's vulnerability became his strength, and his story inspired others to reevaluate what truly mattered in their lives. In his quieter moments, Mike often reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the man who had once been consumed by wealth and status, unable to see past his own fears. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, a reminder of what he had overcome. His journey had been far from linear, but every twist and turn had led him to where he was meant to be. The life he was building with Georgia felt solid, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. They didn't need grand gestures to prove their love. Their bond was evident in the way they supported each other, celebrated small victories, and faced challenges together. Georgia had become more than a partner. She was the person who reminded him daily of the man he had become. As the seasons changed, so did Mike. The city that once felt like a stage now felt like a home, vibrant and full of possibilities. He walked its streets with purpose, knowing that his work was leaving a meaningful mark. His road back wasn't about returning to the life he had known, but about finding his way to a life he had always deserved, a life built on authenticity, purpose, and love. Over the months, Mike realized just how far he had come. The man he once was, a person consumed by ambition, appearances, and fear, felt like a distant memory. His transformation wasn't just external, it was a complete shift in his way of being. The chains of his old life, forged from lies and societal expectations, had been broken. Mike had emerged as someone new, someone who understood the value of truth and authenticity. Georgia played a pivotal role in this rebirth. She hadn't saved him, Mike was clear about that, but she had sparked something within him, a reminder of what he had forgotten about himself. Georgia inspired him to look inward, to confront the parts of his life he had ignored for so long. Their relationship wasn't a grand fairy tale. It was raw, real, and rooted in mutual respect. With her, Mike felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. His projects in the community became the outward expression of his transformation. Mike wasn't just designing buildings. He was creating spaces that brought people together, that gave them hope. He worked closely with families, listened to their stories, and incorporated their needs into his designs. One day, a young boy handed him a crayon drawing of one of the parks Mike had helped revitalize. That small gesture filled him with a sense of purpose that no award or contract had ever given him. Though his new life brought him immense joy, Mike wasn't immune to moments of doubt or reflection. On rare occasions, he crossed paths with Samantha and Jonathan. These encounters were no longer fraught with tension. Instead, Mike felt an unexpected sense of compassion. They were still entangled in the world he had left behind, and while he didn't miss it, he understood its pull. His freedom from that life only deepened his gratitude for the choices he had made. One evening, as he walked through the city with Georgia, Mike stopped in front of a towering building he had designed years earlier. It was grand and imposing, a hallmark of his previous success. Georgia noticed his distant expression and asked, "Do you miss it?" Mike shook his head, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "No," he said. "I finally built something bigger than any skyscraper. I built a life I can be proud of." That realization marked a turning point for Mike. He no longer sought validation from others, nor did he feel the need to justify his choices. His resurrection wasn't just about overcoming his past, it was about fully embracing his present. He had found a balance between his work, his relationships, and his sense of self. This wasn't perfection, it was authenticity, and that was more than enough. The courage Mike had discovered in himself extended beyond his personal life. He began sharing his story with others, speaking at events and mentoring young architects. His vulnerability became his greatest strength, allowing him to connect with people in ways he never had before. He didn't just talk about buildings, he talked about creating spaces that reflected the values of the people who used them. Mike's resurrection wasn't just a personal transformation, it was a rebirth that touched every aspect of his life. He had rebuilt himself from the ground up, casting aside the superficial and embracing the meaningful. With Georgia by his side, he faced each day with a sense of purpose and a deep appreciation for the journey that had brought him here. Under the city lights, Mike felt alive in a way he never had before. His past no longer defined him, nor did it haunt him. It was simply a part of the path that had led him to this moment. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that his resurrection was just the beginning of an even greater story. Mike's return wasn't a physical one, it was a journey back to himself. He had ventured through the darkest corners of his life, faced the lies that once defined him, and emerged renewed. The elixir he brought back wasn't material wealth or accolades, but a profound understanding of what truly mattered: authenticity, connection, and purpose. It wasn't something he could hold in his hands, but it shaped every aspect of his life moving forward. His days were now filled with meaningful work. Mike dedicated himself to revitalizing neighborhoods, designing spaces that fostered community and belonging. He collaborated with Georgia, whose vibrant murals brought color and life to his architectural designs. Their partnership became a reflection of their shared values, an intertwining of art, purpose, and love. Together, they weren't just building spaces, they were building hope. The simplicity of his new life was Mike's greatest treasure. Gone were the days of relentless ambition and hollow pursuits. Now, he found joy in the small moments, the laughter of children playing in a park he had helped create, the warmth of a shared coffee with Georgia after a long day, or the gratitude in the eyes of a family moving into a home he had designed. Each moment reaffirmed that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Mike's story began to resonate beyond the communities he worked with. Invitations to speak at events poured in, and he found himself on stages sharing his journey. But his speeches weren't about success in the traditional sense, they were about purpose. Mike spoke of the courage it took to walk away from a life that no longer aligned with his values and the fulfillment he found in creating something meaningful. His vulnerability inspired others to reconsider their own definitions of success. Though he had left his old life behind, Mike wasn't running from it. Encounters with people from his past, like Samantha or Jonathan, no longer triggered feelings of regret or resentment. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he had come. During one such encounter, Samantha told him, "You've changed, Mike. You seem a lighter." He smiled, simply replying, "I found what I was looking for." Her words, though brief, felt like an acknowledgement of the journey he had undertaken. Georgia was an integral part of Mike's transformation, but she wasn't the sole reason for it. She had been a spark, a guide, but Mike had done the work to reclaim his life. Their relationship wasn't a grand fairy tale. It was real, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. Together, they celebrated life's simple joys, from wandering through city streets to creating projects that touched lives. Georgia had become both his partner and his muse. The return with his elixir wasn't just about the life Mike was building, it was about the man he had become. He no longer sought external validation or feared the judgment of others. His happiness came from within, rooted in the knowledge that he was living a life of integrity and meaning. He had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in the impact he could have on others. Mike often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The man who once chased power and prestige had been replaced by someone who valued simplicity and connection. His transformation wasn't the end of his story, it was the foundation for the life he was now living. Each day felt like a new beginning, a chance to continue creating, loving, and growing. As Mike stood in the heart of one of his newly completed projects, watching a community come to life around him, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The elixir he had found, the wisdom, the authenticity, the purpose, wasn't something he kept for himself. It was something he shared, weaving it into every design, every mural, every relationship. Mike hadn't just returned from his journey, he had returned to himself, and that was the greatest reward of all.